We're delighted to welcome distinguished poet Ruth Padel, Professor of Poetry at King's College London, to give the Jane Harrison Memorial Lecture. The Jane Harrison Memorial Lecture has been hosted by Newnham since 1928. Many of you will know Professor Padel from her recent work, Beethoven Variations, Poems on a Life, a biography of Beethoven in verse, into which she weaves her own family's connection with his work. Others will know her moving Christmas poem, Tidings. Ruth has written collections of verse, a novel, three works on Greek tragedy, and Tigers in Red Weather, a poet's eye account of the endangered tiger population. Her second novel, Daughters of the Labyrinth, set in Crete, will be coming out in July. English students past and present who have taken the tragedy paper may recognise her works on Greek tragedy, often featuring on reading lists. Ruth is also a passionate conservationist, a former trustee and now Life Fellow of the Zoological Society of London. In tonight's talk, she will bring together those many diverse topics: her knowledge of Greek tragedy, her commitment to conservation, her sharp poet's eye, and her gift for the exact phrase to explore hormones, divinity, and forest. There will be time. Ruth has kindly agreed to make time for questions at the end, so I will now switch myself off and hand over to Ruth. Ruth, thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you so much, Alison. And I'd very, very much like to thank the Principal and Fellows of Newnham College for inviting me to give this Jane Harrison lecture. For the honour, of course, but also for the opportunity to record my debt to Jane Harrison, her imagination, her wide-ranging vision, and the way she saw poetry at the heart of things, and also her openness to discoveries of the day, which we will go into. Also, thank you for the opportunity, something which doesn't come along very often, to explore how my own work of 30 years ago informs what I'm doing now. So this is work in progress I'm sharing with you under the aegis of Jane Harrison. Her two great books, Prolegomena to Greek Religion, 1902, and Themis, Social Origins of Greek Religion, 1912, were fundamental to my first prose book, In and Out of the Mind. She focused on the whole sweep of Greek religion from its earliest strata. I just took a few generations of a small population, the Petri dish of classical Athens, about 470 to 404 BC, the people who wrote and first watched Greek tragedies, and also doctors a few generations later who wrote medical tracts. Both the tragedies and those doctors saw human inwardness and suffering, emotional or physical, mainly in terms of things that come at you from outside. When people asked what I was working on, I'd say what the ancient Greeks thought was inside them. Well, ancient Greeks means hundreds of different cultures over 2 millennia, but very generally, their main physical image of what was inside them was animal entrails, the ones they used for divination to divine the will of gods. But conceptually, the language they used suggests they imagined their own inwardness as a kind of earth, an unseen darkness, fertile and therefore female, but again, like female, dangerous and polluting, like the underworld, where dreams come from, but also Furies, who punish you for betraying a relationship. Furies were the demonic form of guilt, embodied curses rising from the dark earth of the mind. Well, a religion is, among other things, a support system. The multiplicity of their gods spoke to the multiplicity of human feelings and relationships. It validated a sense that these feelings were real and powerful and could be in conflict with each other, but as they were outside you, this wasn't wholly your fault. As support systems go, it wasn't a bad one. It allowed for human complexity, a way of coping with conflicted, self-contradictory feelings by imaging them as not human, demonic, and as unpredictable as wild animals. I began by comparing it to the great lived polytheism, Hinduism, little knowing that my work would later get bound up with Indian wildlife and conservation, and how India is experiencing today's battle for nature. That's where this talk is going, as that wonderful tiger suggests. Maybe thinking about how ancient Greeks lived with divinity is an odd route to addressing environmental crisis today, but here we go. In both religions, a god can harm as well as help. Given what's happening at the moment, this is a very hard picture to look at. But here are people praying for help to Kali. But of course, Kali is a destroyer and can also inflict it as well as protect you. In both religions, a god can harm as well as help you in their area of interest. Dionysus can give group ecstasy, but if he's not worshipped in the right way or not respected, he may tear you apart. Apollo sends plague as well as heals it, like the cholera goddesses of India. I'd like to keep that principle in mind as I explore things that were discovered inside us while Harrison was working, especially from 1902 to 1912, the dates of her great books, discoveries which came about through studying plants and birds. In 1880, Charles Darwin and his son Francis established that there was something flowing in plants in particular places that made them climb and follow the light and grow. We now know this something was auxin. It was the first identification of a hormone. And the word itself was coined in 1905 in a lecture to the Royal College of Physicians by UCL Professor of Physiology, Ernest Sterling. The lecture was called On the Chemical Correlation of the Functions of the Body. And the word hormone came from Greek hormao, which means I set in motion, I rush. Horme means an impulse or an energetic effort, a rush that begins a movement. Hormone, the principle, means setting in motion. Hormones were now revealed by Starling's work and others as chemical messengers in the human body too, signaling molecules flowing through our bloodstream, regulating our behavior and development. How is this like Greek experience of gods? Well, setting in motion was exactly what Greek gods did. If you can't see the words at the top of that, gods can make you do bad things, e.g. cause a war. Helen was a great test case. She ran off, she's the world's most beautiful woman, there she is on the left, Helen. And she ran off with Paris, Prince of Troy, leaving her Greek husband. The Greeks went to war to get her back. So was she responsible for the Trojan War? Arguing that case, for and against, was a favorite rhetorical exercise in classical Athens. Euripides' play, The Trojan Women, shows Troy in ruins after the war. Thousands have died. Hecuba, Paris's mother, once the queen of Troy and now a Greek slave, blames Helen. Helen says it wasn't her fault. Aphrodite, there she is, Aphrodite, looking at her. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, made her leave her husband. It was the gods who set in motion the Trojan War. Don't call goddesses corrupt, snaps Hecuba, glossing over your own fault. My son was beautiful, sexiest man in the world. Your mind, your nous, seeing him, was made into the goddess. This was a time of challenging all sorts of things. And how do you solve that? This relief labels the characters in Greek. Persuasion sits on top. The gods are in yellow and the human beings are in pale green. There's divine persuasion sitting overhead. There's Aphrodite, goddess of love, beside Helen, egging her on or enthusing her if she's wavering. And there is her son, Eros, desire feisty with his hand on his hip, looking up at Paris. Hormones in action. We now know hormones have to be in balance. Well, that was a good Greek medical insight too, that all elements of the body had to be in harmonia. Harmonia came from harmotane, to fit together, like strings of a lyre. And the lyre was really the great image of harmonia, music as civilization. But as the philosopher Heraclitus pointed out, harmonia, I suppose like civilization too, depended on tension, the bent back strings of the lyre. There would be no harmony, Heraclitus says, without high and low notes, no animals without the opposites of male and female. The great mythic lyre player was Orpheus. Here he is, taming the wild animals, which could also stand for the wild emotions, of course, drawing all nature to him. And yet, his story ends in failure and loss. He fails to get his love back. And when he returns from the underworld and goes singing about around the world, he is torn to pieces by the Maenads. Harmonia herself was a mythic character, and she too was surrounded by violence. She was daughter of Aphrodite, goddess of love, and Ares, the god of war. Aphrodite's proper husband was the blacksmith of the gods. He was jealous. He made Harmonia for her wedding a necklace with a curse on it. Anyone who stole it would come to destruction. Harmonia exists, in fact, on a knife edge. Just as one hormone out of balance means disease, one slipped string and you get discord. As Darwin said, the balance of nature is a constant struggle. Yellowstone in the US was the world's first national wildlife park. It was established in 1872, but for decades, no one realized that an ecosystem needs all its elements, predators as well as prey, and they went on shooting the wolves. The last wolf was shot in 1926. Only in 1995, that's nearly 80 years after it was established, did 2 horse-drawn sleighs carry 15 grey wolves into the park and release them so predators could return to keep in balance the overgrazing herds. We are all part of this harmonia. We will not survive, for instance, if all the pollinating insects, migratory birds, and pelagic fish vanish from the world. Without that tension of harmonia, all the elements separately are dangerous. Too many moose eat all the plants in Yellowstone. And all the gods, which means also all aspects of humanity, have to be respected, kept in balance. One element left out, one god not worshipped, leads, like the fairy left out of invitations to the christening, to a curse. Sex, for instance, is the area of life which honors the goddess Aphrodite. Hippolytus refrains from it. He worships only the goddess of chastity, and that dishonors Aphrodite, so she makes him die in a chariot crash. In Aeschylus's play, Eumenides, the goddess Athena presides over a trial between really the claims of competing relationships. Apollo defends that between father and child. He has ordered a man to kill his mother because she killed his father. The Furies defend the mother's rights. The man who killed his mother should be punished, whatever she had done. There is a place, the Furies sing, where what is frightening is good and must remain as a guard in the mind. Athena's judgment goes against the Furies, and they feel dishonored. Eventually, she will persuade them to earth themselves in her land, Athens, as its protectors. The citizens will honor them there, a precinct. That is the perfect image, really, for their role in the mind as guardian of conscience. But before that, they threaten to retaliate by poisoning the earth of Athens. I pour venom, they sing, on this earth from my heart, drops spilling on the land in return for my grief. All aspects of human life and feelings are ruled by a complex network of gods. The whole system, bodies and relationship, is like an ecosystem, say a forest, all connected. You have to respect every element. Otherwise, you put the whole thing, Earth itself, at risk. Well, what about the Earth in a real forest? Every forest these days, all over the world, is a violently contested space. Animals want to live in it as they always have. That's where they're evolved, it's their home. Humans want produce from it, timber or meat or honey, or they want the earth beneath for agriculture or minerals. What we all need it for is the ecological service of sequestering carbon, transferring carbon from the atmosphere into biomass accumulated in dead wood and forest soil. 4. The harmonia of a forest starts in the earth. It all depends on the mycelium, a mass of branching filaments growing down from every little fungus. You can see them there in the picture, the little funguses. Long branching threads which join the hair-like root tips of the trees and create underground networks through which the trees themselves exchange nutrients, water, carbon, nitrogen, and sugar. This symbiotic relationship between trees and fungi, the mycorrhizal network, is now nicknamed the Wood Wide Web, on the analogy of the World Wide Web. It's a kind of economic exchange. The fungi, as a fee for their services, take 30% of the sugar, which the trees photosynthesize from sunlight. The sugar fuels them while they scavenge the soil for mineral nutrients, which the trees then absorb. It has, when it was discovered, it was in a way sort of idealized as the perfect form of cooperation. But this picture is itself contested. And as one forest scientist says, at the basis of all cooperative relationships is conflict. I mean, that's a very Heraclitean image, really. A conflict between, where have I got to? Yes, at the basis of all cooperation, all cooperative relationships is conflict. We all want to maximize the payoff from a relationship. Plants and fungi are no different. So the earth itself is alive with that harmonia, that tension between cooperation and competition. Well, to stay with philosophy for a moment, Plato used the musical and medical image of harmonia as a political metaphor. All elements of the body politic should be held in balance. Also, a moral one. All elements of the soul should stay in balance, like, as we now know, hormones. Well, going back to Jane Harrison's day, another word coined in 1905 and another discovery about what is inside us that came about through botanical research is genetics. In 1900, biologist William Bateson learned of Gregor Mendel's experiments with pea plants, which had established many rules of heredity in the 1850s and 60s, but really were only just beginning to be known. Darwin had not known about them at all. William Bateson began teaching a course in Cambridge on evolution and heredity and initiated a research program on Mendel's work. This was unconventional research, and he turned to a group of people who could not yet take degrees, to women scientists. He collaborated with the great botanist Edith Rebecca Saunders, mother of British plant genetics. She was director in botany, first at Girton and then at Newnham, director also of the Balfour Biological Laboratory for Women, set up by Newman to teach female students how to do lab work. Bateson was a champion for degrees for women. His mother served on Newnham's first governing body. His younger sisters studied there too. One became an assistant in botany at the Balfour, and also an assistant for Francis Darwin, who was now a friend of Harrison's and reader in botany, and was married to Ellen Crofts, Newnham's lecturer in English. My own grandmother, Nora Darwin, did not have a direct connection with Newnham. She never took a degree, but she had links to the college through her uncle Francis. And from 1904 to 6, she too studied with Bateson. He suggested she work on primroses, which had fascinated her grandfather, Charles Darwin, because they could flower in different forms. They have triforms. It's very complicated, a very complicated flower, that primrose. She published papers on them in the Journal of Genetics, founded by Bateson. And after she married, she continued experiments on flower propagation. My mother was born in 1919. And when she was young, so that would have been about sort of 1924-5, Nora very unwisely showed her the spurs of the Aquilegia she was propagating in little muslin bags. And I'm afraid my mum wrecked her experiments that year by sucking out the nectar. But going back to 1905, Bateson coined that word genetics, that in a letter. That was the year, the study of heredity, from Greek genos, meaning race or offspring. 4 years later, another botanist, Wilhelm Johansen in Denmark, coined the word gene for the basic factor of inheritance. Maybe I'm pushing things a bit here, but in imagining what it was like to live with Greek gods, I'd like to use the concept of genetic linkage, the tendency of genes close together on one chromosome to be inherited together, like red hair and a hot temper. To think about the whole range of a god's persona. I know that this may sound a bit mad, but we popularly say there's a gene for specific things, just as we say there's a god for something, a god of something. But we know it's more complicated than that. Genes are complicated things, and each god was too. Each god had a range of different linked attributes. Specific objects, places, activities, ideas, and relationships were all linked through one god's identity. Artemis, for instance, was goddess of the moon, but also hunting and chastity. Apollo was god of the sun, but also song and healing. That's why each god has many names. Zeus Xenios was god of the relationship between host and guest. Zeus Bromios was lord of thunder. The lord of the dark sky is lord of the bright sky, as someone said. Dionysus was lord of wine. Here he is. And if you can't see the words, it's Dionysus: wine, wildness, theatre, illusion, mountains, ecstasy, altered consciousness, group excitement, and partying. So he was god of the wine and god of the growing vine, of sap. He would have been god of auxin if they discovered it. He was also god of wildness and mountain forest and theatre. Maybe in a way, gods were more like chromosomes than genes, and the genes were their different attributes or traits. Well, a third discovery, also 1905, it is an extraordinary year, was neural pathways in the brain. In 1889, a Swiss anatomist called Wilhelm His gave the name dendrites, from Greek dendron, tree, to the branchy extensions on nerve cells in the brain. A few years later, Spanish scientist Ramon y Cajal began staining neurons in brain cells of birds. Actually, he used other brain cells as well, but particularly birds. Everyone had thought neurons were a continuous network. The staining them let Cajal see gaps between them and trace the path of nerve cells. Neural pathways grew between them. And he saw that this process explained learning. When you learn a new word, for instance, you're learning a new language and you say a new word, your dendrites branch out and grow to communicate with another cell via the synapse, that tiny gap at the end of a neuron, which we now know is key to the brain's function. When you repeat that word, when you learn it again, the pathway gets stronger, joining the dots. Well, Cahal made amazing drawings. I mean, they probably have been exhibited in art galleries. They are just extraordinary. He was a sort of artist as well as a scientist. And these are neurons arborizing, making like a tree. I think they may well have been from the retina of a greenfinch. They making like a tree, arborizing as they transmit messages to other neurons. And the axon of one neuron communicates with the dendrites of another. Well, we could see the gods like this, really, as electric impulses, sending messages out, like hormones, not in the blood, but in the brain, forging paths through the forest of your mind. Well, while Cahal was discovering the cellular structure of mental life, our life, human life, Freud was digging up the unconscious. In 1893, he used the word subconscious to describe associations and impulses inaccessible to consciousness. Then he dropped that in favor of unconscious and developed a layered image of the mind. On top was the conscious. Below were preconscious thoughts and feelings you're not aware of, but they can be brought to consciousness. Under all lay the unconscious, the primary source of behavior. Our motives and decisions are influenced by past experience, which is stored there underneath everything, like carbon in forest soil. Well, Freud was an obsessive collector of antiquities. He unearthed his patients' traumas, surrounded by objects dug out of earth. He loved archaeology, and that was the great metaphor of the age. It was gradually exposing the Greek Bronze Age, roughly 1800 to 1300 BC. Freud's vision of the layered psyche reflected the different levels of earlier states of civilization at Troy. As the microscope was uncovering secrets of human physiology, a more ancient tool, the humble spade, was exposing secrets of human history. And the layers of the psyche resembled the famous layers, the stratigraphy at Troy. Well, the Lion Gate at Mycenae in the mainland of Greece had been discovered in the 1840s by Kyriakos Pitakis. In 1870, Schliemann, the great Schliemann, began excavating at Troy. He wanted to prove Homer and the Greek myths true. In 1874, he too started excavating Mycenae. He was such a showman. I have gazed, he said, on the face of Agamemnon when he discovered the great gold mask, that he gave archaeology a huge international platform and changed assumptions about the relation between myth and fact, really, what was in the earth, bringing the truths of poetry out into the light of day. Then there was Crete. In 1878, a Cretan antiquarian discovered the palace at Knossos. In 1888, Jane Harrison first visited Greek archaeological sites. 12 years later, Arthur Evans bought Knossos and began digging the palace. Freud was developing his stratigraphy of the psyche just as Minoan civilization was revealed, as if it was the unconscious of ancient Greece. Just as Freud was calling dream a royal road to the unconscious, Sir Arthur Evans exposed a beautiful real road running up to the big open area of Knossos Palace and called that too the Royal Road. Well, in 1900 to 1905, while Evans was busy at Knossos, the British School of Archaeology dug in East Crete at Palekastro. They were hoping for another palace. Instead, in 1904, they found fragments of a limestone slab inscribed with a hymn, which told them they were digging the ancient sanctuary of Dictaean Zeus. And this provided Harrison with a starting point for her book on the social origins of Greek religion, the Hymn of the Curetes. The hymn connects the god's birth with the annual death and rebirth of nature. He, they say, is master of all gone below ground. Will he please return from the underworld and spring to ensure three things: fertility of the earth, justice among citizens, and harmony in both human society and nature. Well, at some level, we all conceptualize our inner world in terms of the outer environment. So did the Greeks. Divinity was a force of nature. The whole ecosystem, rivers, mountains, sea, and fire, was divine. Divine energy crackled and flowed everywhere through the world and also through you. That's why I started with the tiger. That hidden tiger in the night is a perfect image of what it is like to live in a world full of a powerful divinity, hiding in the environment, but also in yourself. You never know when or how it might strike. They used animal entrails and the flight of birds to interpret the will of gods. In their metaphors, they seem to experience their own feelings in terms of nature too, as a wild animal, like those surrounding Orpheus, coming at you violently, animal and demonic, biting, striking, piercing those entrails of yours. And the Greek doctors describe what disease did to the body in very similar terms. We can picture this internal activity in terms of genes or hormones. Their model was what they knew of nature. And divinity was power. You invoked its help. You tried to harness its energy as we use electricity. I mean, it is extraordinary that electricity is going through all our homes, such a dangerous thing, and we earth it. We know its rules. You have to know the rules about how you approach divinity too. And there were shrines throughout Greek homes in which they had to do just that. You had to know the protocol, the health and safety rules. It was fatally easy to offend and get it wrong. As in Hinduism, divinity gets angry if you don't honor it in the proper way. And harnessing doesn't help when it unleashes its full power. When a god gets angry, it attacks what human beings value. It's a bit blurry, I'm afraid, but this is what happens when an elephant loses it. It was in a festival. You can see the mahouts clinging on, and it was amazing nobody was killed. They often are. It's very methodical in its way. It does go on to, see, look at it picking up the yellow truck. Right in the air. Well, temple elephants in Kerala make their owners a lot of money at the festivals, but there is controversy about their treatment. There's a film called Gods in Shackles and a book called Gods in Chains, and animal charities have documented a lot of abuse. They're kept chained, alone, and dressed in heavy glitter for festivals, upset by the crowds and firecrackers and motorbikes, and controlled only by the sharp bullhook, which often leaves festering wounds. That's why they often get angry. This one just smashed up a bike and that truck in a 4-hour rampage. But I could show you videos of them doing the same thing to people. The rage of Dionysus in the Bacchae, or Aphrodite and Hippolytus, punishing men who refuse to worship them, may seem violent and out of proportion to the offense. But that's divinity, the electricity principle. Harness it at your peril and respect it. Observe the rules. An elephant is a god, sacred. People pay to be touched and blessed by them. Gaja Puja, honoring the elephant, removes obstacles and makes you rich, because elephants are the living incarnation of the most popular god of all, Ganesh. I think it's no coincidence that the only animal whose shape is mixed with human in a god is an elephant. The monkey god Hanuman is all monkey. Trained elephants are useful and often affectionate, but in the forest they can be the most dangerous wild animal of all. Most forest animals, even tigers, really want to get out of your way. Even a king cobra would rather not see you and not be seen. Elephants evolved to think you should get out of theirs. But because all over the world, all forest territory is now so contested and encroached on, elephants all over Asia are anxious and disturbed. In India, they kill over 500 people a year. So an elephant has ambiguous resonances. Ganesh has 108 names, including remover of obstacles. And in popular imagination, he has a fun-loving, cuddly identity. You pray to him in starting any enterprise. But there's a hidden violence in his story. His father, Shiva, tore off his original head and stuck an elephant head on instead. With a left swinging trunk, Ganesh stands for the, like that one, to his left. Ganesh stands for the material prosperity he bestows, represented by the sweets he always loves. And you worship him, you put him in your home. But with a right swinging trunk, he is unpredictable and appears only in temples. He fulfills your wishes if you pray with proper devotion, but any mistake in ritual provokes his anger, and everyone knows how destructive an angry elephant can be. Well, the way the multiple gods, Greek or Hindu, guard their status, their jealous demand to be honored, how disastrously easy it is to offend them, all this is summed up in the concept of territory. You never know in Greek myth when you might be stepping into a god's sanctuary. The Greek hero Philoctetes blunders unaware into territory sacred to a nymph and is bitten by a snake, which makes a wound that never heals. That idea of sacred territory you don't realize you're encroaching on is useful in thinking about land we share with wild animals. The UK is one of the most degraded ecosystems in the world. Only 3% of our land is in a good state for nature. There are wonderful conservationists, but we're not doing well with the wild species we had because it all depends in the end on politics and economics. In India, much more is left, but the stakes are much higher. There are more to lose. And you never know whose territory you might be in. Riding a motorbike down a road through a forest, for instance, you may disturb a wild elephant who is indeed a remover of obstacles. India has some of the strongest laws in the world for protecting wildlife and its habitat, but they're often not implemented. More roads through forests are built all the time, which means more roadkill and confrontations. On an English country road, you might meet a flock of sheep, but not a family of very upset and angry elephants. YouTube, if you go on it, will give you endless footage of elephants attacking motorbikes and their riders, and the riders throwing stones to keep them off. Building a road through sacred territory puts everyone in danger. Sacred territory is not just geographical. In Greek terms, external nature, the trees and animals, earth, is linked to our own inwardness. You honor, that's where that sort of genetic linkage idea comes in. You honor a god by performing the activities they rule, sex or dancing or work, making a contract, making a friend, and by thanking the god for it, acknowledging their help. If you break the rules, it's not going to end well. We are the god's territory. Our territory, or what we think of as ours, is also theirs. Well, I began In and Out of the Mind by quoting an imaginary, newly discovered Homeric hymn by the American poet Charles Olson, dedicated to Jane Harrison. I've only just now realized this parallel with Themis, how she began with a hymn to the Curetes. I wasn't consciously imitating her. I wanted to emphasize the strangeness of how the Greeks thought. And I just discovered Charles Olson. And when you find a poet who sets you alight, it's like falling in love. You get to see new things. And Olson's invocation of Harrison in imagining strangeness, people who come into life by a different gate, who are not easily known, really spoke to me. Well, Harrison lived in that time of such fertile strangeness, of seeing hidden new things about ourselves. The cave paintings at Altamira, that's another thing, were discovered in the 1870s, but were so extraordinary, so contrary to popular thought about early humans and early human art, that most experts refused to believe they were Paleolithic, until similar discoveries in France around 1900 meant they had to accept them. I want to emphasize how all these turn of the century discoveries were linked to nature and earth. Harrison's Prolegomena was published the same year as Kipling's Just So stories and Peter Rabbit. 4 years later came Wind in the Willows. So while people were recognizing that the earliest works of human art were paintings of animals, while secrets of what lay inside us were discovered through works on plants, while new layers of human history were dug up from the earth, at the same time arrived a new genre of literature for a so far little valued readership. Animal stories of the unnoticed wild suddenly enhanced the so far unstudied inner life of children, making people aware of the value of nature and what goes on under the surface in new ways. Well, this has been a gallop through a lot of things, but at the bottom of them all is honoring the complexity, like the tiny but all-powerful mycorrhizal filaments through which tree roots communicate in the forest, under the earth, of connections between ourselves and earth. Lockdown showed us how we yearn for nature. I gather the Newnham students before finals last year begged for guinea pigs to cuddle, and they couldn't be given them because they couldn't be sterilized between each cuddle. But I do appreciate that Newnham is perhaps the only Oxbridge college that has badgers at the bottom of its garden. We all yearn for nature. And among the huge external challenges facing us, attacks on democracy, the climate crisis, the degradation of nature, is a more internal one. How to handle our own eco-grief. Not only the loss of nature, but our guilt for that. We have become our own furies, dripping toxins we invented on the earth. To cope with that, it might be a good idea to take a leaf out of the ancient Greek book, which articulated the divinity of what was both around you and inside you. Even those of us who don't share, who know nothing of the theologies of Islam, Judaism, or Christianity, could consider A, honoring the complex connections of what is alive around us and what is inside us, sloshing around in our bloodstream, forging our neural pathways, which are also nature, and, like the rest of nature, need to be in balance. B, recognizing that the two, that is nature outside, but also nature inside, are intrinsically interconnected. And C, maybe even calling the medium of that connection sacred. In one form or another, sacred and divine have been at the core of human identity for millennia. Maybe remembering that principle that gods harm through the medium in which they help, we could expand our idea of sacred to include not only what we love and find joy in valuing, but also something which we have to honor, like a wild elephant, and will destroy you if you don't respect its rules. There you are, Alison.
Here I am, Ruth. Thank you so much for that amazing picture of all the developments that were going on at the time of Jane Harrison in psychology, genetics, hormones, animal stories, weaving that in with Greek myth, philosophy, India, and also bringing in the Batesons. I was just looking at them as you were talking, so there's a lot of things I need to discover there and their links with Newnham. So thank you. I love that phrase, honouring the complexity of connections between ourselves and nature. So we can see some questions coming in already. So the first one, which I think links in a little bit with where you ended, how can we learn from COVID and echo grief? And what's the role of poetry in helping us do that?
That's such a big question. It's a very good question. Well, we have to step up to the plate, and poetry, like all art, is a witness to what's going on now. But the big thing to influence is to try and influence is those politicians. I mean, part of the Conservative agenda, for instance, the Cumbrian coal mine, is absolutely disastrous for the economy, and we have to say so as well as we can. I mean, writers have a place. I mean, when I wrote the Tiger book, I went into the forests and met conservationists. I felt humble and useless, really. I felt, here are all these wonderful Indian scientists doing things, putting their lives on the line. All I'm doing is writing. But actually, at the end of it, when the book came out, I suddenly would get a phone call from somebody in America or Canada saying, I've read your book, how can I give money to the Tiger? So I could feed her back to the scientists whom I'd for instance, I've just read in the Guardian today a really wonderful and very hard-hitting and ferocious piece by the writer Jeet Thayil about what's going on now in the Indian COVID catastrophe. Writers, if you speak honestly and know your facts and put them together well and respect the facts, that's, we're not politicians, but there's a voice.
You can often get through in a different way, I think. Well, looking into what you were saying on politics, someone said, Serena Jenks has said, I feel you should have been consulted on HS2 by the government. She lives in Warwickshire, where they've lost some beautiful ancient woodlands full of hundreds of years of nature and divinity. Any thoughts on how we get better at minimising the impact on our ancient woodlands, or make the case of the ancient woodlands?
No, I mean at the moment we have a government that doesn't listen and can afford not to listen, as yesterday's events showed. It's very frightening. I mean, the thing is that economy and ecology are the same word. They both come from the word oikos, meaning house or home, and the oikonomos is law, and oikologos is sort of word or logic or argument. So the law of the oikos and the argument of the oikos should be the same thing. Ecology is the deepest and the biggest economics. But as Gandhi said, there is enough in the world for everybody's need, for not for everybody's greed. And the greed of economics at the moment is terrifying. And I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to that.
No, well, it's interesting. I mean, I was formerly an ambassador at a time when Boris Johnson was Foreign Secretary, and people were always very surprised that he was passionate about preserving animals that were at risk of going extinct. But in a sense, it's easy to do it in somebody else's territory. Actually, keeping an eye on what you've got at home is a challenge, I think.
Well, his father was a great conservationist, so that was where he learned that.
Yes, yes. So back to the Greek gods and the idea of sacrifice. Is there any of that in play here? Someone has asked.
That's interesting. Well, you have, I mean, the whole idea of sacrificing to the gods is offering them. It is part of what you give to them. It's part of the respect you pay them. And quite often, quite a lot of myths are concerned with a god being angry because he or she doesn't get the right sort of sacrifice. But I don't think the idea of sacrifice in a Christian sense, of sacrificing something of ourselves, of self-sacrifice, I don't think that's not part of the Greek sort of cartography of myth in a way. But maybe it should be. I mean, all religions. One of the terrible things, although I'm arguing for the idea of sanctity, one of the terrible things I realized when I was studying tigers was tigers go past every big religious symbol. There are tigers in Christian lands in Russia. They go past the cross. There are tigers in Muslim lands, Bangladesh, Sumatra, and there are tigers in Hindu lands and Buddhist lands in Burma. But none of those religions, although they all say violence is a bad thing, none of those religions will stop people persecuting tigers. No religion actually stops people doing bad. Enough people stop doing bad things.
Emma Maudsley, one of our fellows, picks up on that tension, if you like. All too often, defending nature in India is at the expense of people who make their lives and livelihoods in forests, often considered poor or marginalised ethnically. It's really complicated, but what are your thoughts about resolving this? And Emma empathised with your video because she has been chased by a wild elephant in India.
Wow, yes. Well, as it happens, one of my brothers has for 40 years has fought very much on the side of the Adivasis and tribal people in India. So he and I have very opposed groups of friends in India often. I think the awful thing is that the forces of economic growth manage to divide and rule, so that they will offer people who live in the forest a road, because these people don't have a hospital or a school, and wouldn't you like a hospital road? So there comes the road, and with the road comes the poaching, and so the people who depended on the forest for food are now finding that the animals go down and they can't do the poaching. So it's they can't any longer live, because the world outside is so different. They can't any longer live in the way that they did. And often I'm sure there are a lot of Indian people listening here too, and they will know much better than me that often in the past, sanctuaries, animal sanctuaries, wildlife sanctuaries have been formed at the expense of people in the forests. The good ways of doing it are to consult them. I mean, I went down in Karnataka to a place called Badra, which had people living, not tribal people, but Hindus living in the forest, and they were consulted about how they would like to live. And it was a huge operation. It took 10 years. They said what sorts of house they'd like to live in, and so then I went to the forest, which was then empty of people, and the animals had come back, and there were gaur grazing where there had been villages, there were people. And then I went to visit the people, and I asked one of the old men who was there, talking to another old man, and they'd lived in different villages, and they would have been having to sort of go across rivers through snakes and leopard territory to meet each other before, what they liked in living there in this new place outside the forest. They were waiting for their granddaughters to come home from school in a bus, and they said, well, here we have power. And what they meant was electricity, I think. I didn't know the language, but I think it was also a kind of metaphor for they could have their own autonomy. They could walk where they wanted. So they were happy to be out of the forest. Other people might, I mean, I think the way of protecting a forest ought to be to get the people who live in it to be the protectors. But there are political problems with that.
Going back to the idea of hormones and also metaphors, and specifically feminine versions of hormones, someone asks, is there something to be said about Mother Nature, menstruation and femininity, and therefore the destruction of nature, intervention and healthcare globally?
Yes, huge questions and very, very important. First of all, picking up the idea of Mother Nature. I mean, I didn't have room for all the wonderful pictures of Earth, Gaia, and pleading for her children as a woman. And so the idea of earth nurturing is, I think, sort of absolutely crucial to all systems at the beginning. And then healthcare and children. I mean, our system is the earth is a female system. It produces things, it produces life and nurtures life. And I'm not quite sure where we're going with healthcare, except that it is very clear that often it's women's healthcare is downgraded at the expense of male ones. You know, and so, but you know, resources are so difficult. I mean, this is such a difficult area to talk about because everything is connected to everything else. Yeah, I don't know. I don't feel I've answered your question properly, but it would take a book.
Well, moving more on to writing, there's a couple of questions about that. Matalinda Nabagodi, who's one of our postdoctoral affiliates, who's a writer, English researcher, she said she loves how your talk wove together so many different areas of knowledge into a lecture. It felt almost like a poem with its rhythms and repetitions. Could you say something about the relationship between the research that you clearly do enormous amounts of, and then, she's put this in brackets, creative stroke poetic, close brackets, writing?
What a lovely question. Thank you. I think this is the only way I can operate. I can't operate another way, but because I think I'm rather like those mycorrhizal roots. I mean, I see connections and they feel connected, but I don't know how. Or maybe like the neurons, which I have to sort of join the gaps, but I don't know how. And actually, you know, writing a poem is easier than doing this because ever since PowerPoint, you have the images too. And so I get beguiled by the images and then I have to chase after the research that goes with them. And, you know, I'm sure I've got a lot of bits of science wrong and what the axons are doing and how they're connecting to the dendrites and things like that. I'm sure I've got those wrong, but some of all, you know, superficial. But I think in a way, J.D. Salinger talked about the fire between the words. And he, you know, when he's talking about writing, there's so much you can cut out. Poetry is the art of trying to cut away as much as possible, to say as little as possible. So you leave the connections underground. And also the reader can pick them up and play with them and they can resonate in their own way in a reader's mind. And I think probably that's how I do research too. That's probably why I left academia.
No, when it's, I mean, I know we've got one or two other poets on the call, and I will love listening to your definition of poetry. There was amazing. I didn't quite get it all down, but I'll listen to the recording again. So another one about your writing, again, this connectedness, which is clearly part of who you are. Your work, Beethoven Variations, seems to me to be your way of honouring the complexity of musical and physical connections. Could you talk a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah. It was also a way of going into my childhood because chamber music and playing viola and playing quartets was a very much part of our childhood, and of my parents. My mother sort of fairly recently died, and looking back to my dad who died some time before, and Beethoven. I mean, we have a photograph of my father's family when my father was a little boy, about 8, playing their instruments, and with his father and mother. And there is a sort of white bust of Beethoven glowering over them all, rather like Persuasion on that pedestal. And I think that was at the back of my mind somewhere. And so I had to go to the places. I also like travel, and I thinking of Jane Harrison and, you know, reading Mary Beard's wonderful biography of her and how she went to Greece and, you know, what she did and the fun she had and going on mules over the Greek mountains and things. I do love the physicality of place, and connecting that with Beethoven's life. I'd been to Vienna before, but I hadn't been to Bonn. And then I was lucky enough to be invited to go to Silesia, and I saw a palace there, and I went to Krakow. So it was, and I actually saw his manuscripts. It was amazing. I actually, my brother said, don't tell this, you shouldn't have done this, because I certainly shouldn't have. But in the archive, when the librarian wasn't looking, I did kiss the corner of the page of Opus 132, the slow movement, 131, I think. But it was just so amazing to have that connection with his life, which was so full of pain, but also of thought. And he did live life very fully, though he was in a lot of suffering a lot of the time. And out of it came this extraordinary stuff, which is still, setting us on fire.
No, that's fascinating. Again, as a former diplomat, I know what you mean. If you go to a place, you pick up something that you just can't read about. There is something about the physicality of being there, which is really important. And then perhaps round to full circle for what looks as though it's going to be our last question. Supplication and suppliancy are huge in Greek tragedies. Mass grief is something we have seen, and of course are seeing, particularly in India, but also Turkey, so much at the moment. Are we at a turning point in going through this?
Suppliancy is so important. Sacred ground, and the idea that when a suppliant comes onto the sacred precinct, they themselves are sacrosanct, is incredibly important, of course. And when I'm watching the almost unbearable scenes in India and reading Jeet's piece in The Guardian, it's like the beginning of the Oedipus Rex, with the chorus begging for help from the plague. But I was also thinking of, I've been to Lesbos quite a few times in the last 5 years because I wrote a book about migration, and I'm following up with that, with work with a Syrian artist called Isam Kubaj, who might even be listening. I hope he is. And it's been really important to go there. The physicality, as you say, the physicality of the place and the people who are there, their desperate need. And also, when I was first on Lesbos, I happened to see a playbill for Aeschylus's play, The Suppliant Women. And I thought, what a really brilliant idea of the Greek dramatist who decided to do that there, because that is a play about a whole lot of women coming for supplicating for sanctuary from the East, who actually have a connection with Greece, though they don't look as if they do. And I thought, this sense of the Greek sense of everybody coming to Lesbos, escaping war and destruction and persecution to Greece, it's another terribly painful and difficult area of what we have to think about. I don't know if we're at a turning point. But again, it depends on politics. It depends on, well, Alison's sphere of diplomacy, and everything is interconnected. But it would be nice to think that we're at a turning point.
Well, rather fortuitously for me, the final 3 questions remaining are actually more wonderful summaries to end with. So Katie Edgecombe wants to say hi to you because she played chamber music when she was schoolgirl. She was Katie Padmore then. She's one of our fellows emerita. So another connection there, which is great. Someone thinks that your voice would be amazing on a platform such as Sam Harris or Jordan Peterson to talk about and bring a direly needed focus to ecological collapse to a huge audience. Love the talk, thank you.
Thank you so much.
And then my favourite, which is a comment from Alistair Llewellyn-Smith, a tapestry that Penelope might have woven. That's what he feels about your lecture. Great stuff, Ruth.
Well, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to do this. I mean, I feel it was almost a little indulgent, but because I was bringing in so many things, but people seem to have
People have sparked on so many elements. Ruth, we would have loved to have had you in person. I promised, and I promised the fellowship that we will have you in person to a dinner when we're able to do that again. But I do know that doing it on Zoom has enabled us to reach a very wide audience. I know we've got at least one viewer I can see from the States, and I think others as well. So we really, really appreciate that. Again, I'm afraid it falls to me to do the round of applause, because I could get everybody to raise their hands on the participants list, but yes, people are doing that for me. So there's lots of hand waving going on as a way of saying how wonderful your talk was. And thank you for agreeing that we could record it. So when it's been edited, people will be able to listen again and just savor some of those very, very deep concepts that you've introduced us to. So a huge thank you for this year's Jane Harrison lecture. We really, really appreciate it and really look forward to seeing you in person. And thank you everybody for joining us this evening.